Hey guys, Spirit of the Law here. Age of Empires 2 can be an intimidating game to learn. The second the game begins, you already have to make decisions. There are things you can build, resources to collect, and it's not always intuitive how to put your best foot forward. It might even feel like as long as you're keeping the villagers busy, it doesn't matter what you have them working on. But really, the first 15 or so villagers on land maps should always do roughly the same things in the same order every time. There is one exception I'll talk about, but other than that, nearly every build order starts the same way for a reason. And for this video, I want to show not just how they all start, but more importantly, show you why it works. So you're not just memorizing, but understanding. That's the goal, at least. So without further ado, let's take a look. To start the game, you want to queue up villagers and build 2 houses. One of them with 2 villagers, usually the ones closest together, and the other with 1 villager. Just a tip, you want to use hotkeys to make these things happen as quickly as possible. Now, one of these houses is incredibly important, and maybe surprisingly, one isn't critical at all. Which house do you think is the more important one? It's the one with 2 villagers. Why? Because as soon as a villager comes out of the town center, we'll be at 5 out of 5 population, and can't train another until a house is built. Now, a villager takes 25 seconds to make, and coincidentally, a house takes 25 seconds to build. But we queued up the villager first, and the builders need to walk to the house foundation. So a single builder isn't going to make it in time. 2 builders working together, though, can make a house in 19 seconds. That's enough to usually avoid hitting the housing cap, which is nice because there's nothing worse than being housed already 25 seconds into the game. Now, there are a few civilization exceptions here. One is the Mayans, who start with an extra villager, putting you at 5 out of 5 for your housing cap at the beginning, in which case you want to get loom right away while you build the first houses. Another exception is the Chinese, who start with no food. In that case, you really want to prioritize getting food as quickly as possible, and also picking up loom to keep the town center busy. Another odd case is the Huns, who don't need to build houses at all. Going back to our generic civilization though, hopefully by the time they're done the first house and the first villager comes out, you already have sheep at least on the way to the town center. One thing you'll notice in all build orders is after our houses, we put villagers on sheep until we have 6. Now the reason for this is simple. We want to keep the town center working constantly. Villagers cost 50 food and take 25 seconds to train. After that, you can expect them to generate somewhere around 20 of whatever resource they're working on per minute. That means within 2.5 minutes, any villager you create in Dark Age should have paid for itself, and everything after that is pure profit. They're an amazing return on investment, so we want a lot of them. Any villager we make in the Dark Age will pay for itself 12 times over in the next 30 minutes. As a general rule, somewhere between half and 2/3 of your maximum population space available should be villagers. With standard settings, we don't want to stop making them until we have more than 100. Now the reason for 6 on sheep and not 4 or 5 is because constantly creating villagers takes 120 food per minute. An individual shepherd averages a little over 19 food per minute over time, which means with 6 shepherds we almost have enough to keep up villagers continuously. You might think that implies we need 7, but what saves us here is we have a bit of time before the 6th shepherd comes out where we can build a bit of a buffer. By 1 minute and 15 seconds as the 6th villager comes out, we're using the last of our starting food to queue up the 7th. Your starting shepherd should have gathered somewhere between 50 and 70 more, though it's likely they'll still be holding on to most of that and it'll trickle into your stockpile as they hit their maximum carry limit of 10. Now while we're on the topic of villagers having collected but not yet dropped off resources, I want to make a quick note here about force dropping off food. That's when you're a little short of the resources you need, so you grab your villagers and manually task them to drop off food at the town center and then tell them to go back to work. Now this is unavoidable sometimes, especially if your sheep come in a bit late, but you'll want to avoid doing it too much for a couple of reasons. First of all, of course, there's a moment in there when you're having them stop working. As we've seen, they already can't quite keep up with what you need, and this is just going to increase that deficit. The other problem is that once you force drop off, you can get stuck having to do that for every villager. Even if these 6 shepherds did manage to collect the full 50 food needed by the time the newest villager comes out, that would mean they're each individually only holding 8 or 9. Since they won't automatically drop it off until they're holding 10, you have to help them out by doing it manually. The point is, if you have to, you can force drop off to keep villagers queued up, but it's worth avoiding early on if possible. In Definitive Edition, it's also a good idea to queue up your sheep by holding down Shift and clicking them in the order you want them to be eaten. That way the villagers quickly and automatically move from one to the next, And if you find the sheep relatively fast, you should be able to get by without forcing shepherds to drop off early. Now, I say it's 6 on sheep, but there's actually a couple of odd cases I want to quickly point out. First of all, Britons have 25% faster shepherds, so 5 of their shepherds are actually better than most civilizations with 6. Because of that, it's pretty normal with Britons to just stick with 5. Again, Chinese also have a bit of a weird start with their 3 extra villagers. In their case, it's not uncommon to put 7 on sheep for the first little bit, again because 6 isn't quite enough to cover constant production, and having to force drop-off constantly isn't ideal. Another odd case is the Aztecs, who have 5 extra carry capacity, meaning you'll need to force drop-off more often, simply because they won't be dropping it off on their own as much. Now, all that being said, if you're new to the game, idle time is going to happen. It's not the end of the world, but we do know what a good investment villagers are, and that's why we want to minimize it as much as possible. So to recap, normally we start with 2 houses and then 6 on sheep. With that, we have our food income stabilized for the time being and have a new concern: wood. In just under 3 minutes, we'll hit our population cap if we don't make a house, and at some point we also want to make a mill for the berries. That's 750 food the map is gifting us, so we want to take it. But we also want enough wood income to be able to make houses and camps for all the villagers we make in the future. 99% of build orders at this point send villagers to wood, and the first villager is going to make a lumber camp at a safe nearby woodline. Now you might wonder why we don't use the trees scattered around the town center that are much closer. The reason is to save those for villagers that we want to move onto farms later, but don't have enough wood to build them. Having those future farmers chop what we call the straggler trees gives those villagers something to do around the town center while they wait for the wood for a farm, and it might also happen to help them build that farm sooner anyway. The point is, it's best to keep straggler trees around if you can, though it's not that big of a deal. But once we have a lumber camp up against a nearby tree line, how many do we put on wood? Well, let's think it through. After however many lumberjacks we're going to make, the next villager is going to lure a boar, and then the one after is going to make a house and a mill. For most civilizations, we should have 50 wood at the moment after our camp, and we need to get to 125. If we put 3 on wood, then we should have about 100 in total as that 12th villager comes out to make the house and mill, though not necessarily all of that wood will be dropped off by the lumberjacks yet. That's obviously not enough wood for both buildings, but if we build the house first, by the time it's done we should have enough to mill the berries either right away or within a few seconds. Technically, putting 3 on wood works, but it's a little tight, especially if you're having other small inefficiencies in your play. 3 on wood is most common when you really want as many villagers on food as quickly as possible, like if you're going for scouts. Compare that with the more standard 4 on wood. That gives us ideally more like 140 to 150 wood as the house and mill builder comes out. Even if some of that is still being held by the lumberjacks and hasn't been dropped off, by the time we build the next house, we'll have far more than enough to afford the mill. It's smoother, it's one less thing to worry about, and with the exception of maybe a few aggressive strategies, 4 lumberjacks is the standard. Now, water maps are a little different since you'll be building ships, which of course cost wood, but for this video I'm just going to focus on land maps. Again, just to recap, at this point you'll have 6 shepherds and now 4 lumberjacks, giving us 10 villagers in total, plus our scout. To be ideal, it's nice to have 2 lumberjacks or lumberjills on each side of the camp, and it's good to check on them now and then to make sure they aren't trapping each other. Even if they aren't working at full efficiency though, remember we can get away with just 3. At this point, conventionally you send the next villager to lure a boar. If everything's gone perfectly, your 6 shepherds will usually be partway through the 4th sheep, and the timing should be fairly clean so that the boar comes in roughly as they're finishing. If not, it's totally fine to take the 5th sheep to avoid having them idle for too long. If you're wondering why we're taking a boar, I know I keep mentioning it, but our shepherds, remember, weren't fully keeping up with our food demands. We need something that collects a little faster if we want to not just keep up villagers, but actually start accumulating the 500 food to advance, which the boar happens to be perfectly suited for with its faster collection rate. As that lure is happening, the next villager coming out is our house and mill builder. This can actually be a bit of a stressful moment, as you want to not let the boar kill your luring villager, you want to prevent the shepherds from killing another sheep just as the boar comes in, and you also want the next villager to head in the direction of the berries and make a house. All of this while trying to keep up town center production and maybe even scout a bit as well. It's a lot going on. In this moment, the most important thing is to not lose the villager to the boar and garrison if things look dicey. Again, villagers pay for themselves 12 times every half hour. So losing a villager at this point is a huge loss in the long run, and far more important than any of the other things going on. After the boar lure and the house, as the next villager comes out, you should have far more than enough wood for the mill, especially if you have 4 on wood. Again, with 3 on wood, this part can be a bit tight, and sometimes you have to make the mill after collecting berries for a few seconds. I wouldn't recommend force dropping off any lumberjacks in order to make that happen sooner. You then want to send villagers to berries until you have 4 or 5. At this point, our 7 on board should be giving us way more than we need to keep villagers coming out, so it's not critical how many we have on berries. It's more about just making use of what the map is giving us and making sure to have 500 food at least when we want to click up. Now, as you're sending villagers to berries, you'll probably be doing a lot of scouting and also some force dropping off with the boar, because hunters carry a lot of food. Also, as you're sending the next 4 or 5 villagers to berries, generally at some point you'll go and lure the second boar, either with a new villager being created, or by sending one of the current boar hunters and then replacing it with the next one you create. There's lots of ways to do it, but the general rule is you want to go and get the second boar when the first one has around 150 or so food left. At this point, we're past 15 villagers, and there's lots of ways the game could go. The most general rule, if you're going for an aggressive strategy, would be to put more on food at this point so you can advance quickly. Other strategies might call for wood. Either way, just make sure to keep queuing up villagers and to pick up loom before going to feudal age. Now, all this being said, these aren't hard and fast rules. There's definitely some flexibility here and more advanced tricks that you can learn, but in my experience, this is the most standard way to start with the first 15 villagers for just about any strategy. And in fact, up to this point, you might not even know what strategy you're going to do yet. Hopefully though, this video gives you an idea of why a lot of these conventions have become the norm. That's all for this one though. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll see you next time.